You're listening to Behind the Sermon from Three Crosses Church. Today we are looking at a few small words that make a big difference to how we understand Paul's views on marriage. Hello, my name is Tom Richards and you're listening to Behind the Sermon, where we unpack the deeper questions and hidden details behind our Sunday sermon. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 6, Paul says, "I say this as a concession, not as a command." And the question is, what is the this and what is the concession? Is Paul referring to what he just said or what he's about to say? And in this case, the grammar would allow for either, so it doesn't give it away. Now remember, when Paul wrote this, along with Sosthenes, there were no paragraphs. But because we're trained to read in paragraphs, the way that your translation sets out the text will change the way you understand it. So as I read verses 1 to 9, listen for whether verse 6 seems to look backward at what Paul has just said or forward at what he says next. So I'm going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 9. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So if the this refers to what comes before it, it could refer to all of verses 2 to 5, which would mean that the concession is that husbands and wives should have sexual relations, as in that they should have them at all, suggesting that Paul views sex negatively. And we're going to call that option 1 just to help us keep track. It could also just refer to verse 5, which would mean that the concession is that a married couple could deprive each other of intimacy temporarily. That would suggest that Paul views marital intimacy positively, in fact so positively that he permits couples to refrain from it only in limited circumstances, and we're going to call that option 2. On the other hand, if the this referred to what Paul was about to say, then the concession would be what's in verses 8 and 9, that it's good for single people and widows to remain unmarried. And we're going to call that option 3. Now, as I said, there's no little trick of grammar in the original Greek that gives it away. So we need to work through the context, and in this case, it really hangs on what we think verse 1 means. So let's go to that. It starts, "Now for the matters you wrote about." So it seems that the Corinthian church has written to Paul and Paul's replying to them. Then it says, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." And the question is whether those are Paul's words to the church or the words the church had written to Paul. If they're Paul's words, then that would point to option 1 being correct. Paul would then believe that generally people should not have sex, so allowing married couples to have sex is a concession. But I think there's good reasons to think that Paul's actually quoting the Corinthians' view. So firstly, the language of the letter points us in that direction. Paul begins in the same way elsewhere as he introduces questions by the Corinthians, and quoting their own words would be a natural way to identify the issue that he's addressing, to raise it and then address it. The phrase, "it is good," the first words, also appear again in verse 26 and seem to be something of a Corinthian catchphrase that Paul is quoting. So the language points that way. Secondly, it makes better sense of the wider context. It would be strange for Paul to state his own position in verse 1 and then immediately contradict it in verses 2 to 5 and never really return to unpack it in a direct way. It would also sit awkwardly with his positive teaching about marriage later in the chapter, as well as what he says elsewhere in passages such as Colossians 2 and Ephesians 5. Finally, I think this is the strongest reason, there's a noticeable change in perspective between verse 1 and verses 2 to 5. So verse 1 says, "It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." And that's written entirely from a man's perspective, treating him as the one who initiates sexual relations, and that view's typical of the ancient world. But in verses 2 to 5, Paul speaks equally to husbands and wives. Each has responsibilities towards the other, and neither has authority over their own body independently of the other. That perspective is strikingly mutual, and it's a uniquely Christian perspective. So verse 1 most likely gives us the Corinthians' view, while verses 2 to 5 give us Paul's response. And that rules out option 1, because option 1 depends on verses 2 to 5 being Paul's reluctant concession. Instead, those verses are his positive correction of the Corinthians' view. We're therefore left with options 2 and 3. Now, if option 2 is correct, then that highlights that Paul sees sexual intimacy as the norm in Christian marriage. If option 3 is correct, then that highlights that although he disagrees with the Corinthian suggestion that as a general rule, Christians should be celibate, he does concede that for some people, singleness and so celibacy is preferable. Either way, Paul affirms both marital intimacy and celibate singleness as good gifts from God. But of the two remaining options, I think option 3 is more likely because it makes better sense of the position of verse 7, where Paul says that he wishes that all were like him, which naturally links to verses 8 and 9. But verse 7 in itself doesn't introduce a new thought, whereas verse 6 does. The words, "I say," introduce that new thought, and then verse 7 follows that thought and flows naturally into verses 8 and 9. And that makes it more likely that the concession concerns Paul's preference for singleness. All of this may seem rather pedantic, but it does make a significant difference. Option 1 would make marriage and intimacy a reluctant concession for people who lack self-control, whereas options 2 and 3 allow Paul to affirm the goodness of marital intimacy and the goodness of singleness while guarding against sexual sin. And that sets up the whole chapter. The Corinthians appear to be asking whether celibacy is the Christian ideal, even perhaps whether married Christians should separate. And Paul responds by considering marriage, engagement, singleness, and divorce. And those are the questions that we're going to start exploring at church this week and then over the next 3 weeks. I'll see you there. Three Crosses Church exists to know and glorify God by being and making disciples who love, trust, and obey Jesus.